So what happened to the mountain of God? Why is the mountain of the Lord not yet exalted? What happened to the sacred center that once drew nations upward in longing and reverence? Why does humanity seem enthralled by false heights, mesmerized by idols fashioned from its own hands, while fleeing the true majesty of God? Isaiah chapter 2 has long puzzled interpreters with its dramatic shifts, from visions of universal peace to terrifying judgment, from promises of divine instruction to scenes of human collapse. Traditional readings often isolate its verses, utopian, eschatological, apocalyptic. But what if the chapter isn't a fragmented collage, but a deliberate map of spiritual disintegration and restoration? Our approach discerns Isaiah 2 as a sequence of interrelated triads, patterns of affirmation and negation, that trace the systemic dynamics of covenant faithfulness and failure. Each verse unveils a dynamic interplay between vocation, order, and sovereignty. Through this lens, the chapter becomes not a prophetic monologue, but a dialogical unveiling between divine vision and human distortion, between what is and what ought to be. This reading neither flattens the text into abstraction nor moralizes it for convenience. Instead, it reveals Isaiah 2 as a profound architecture of truth, one that names how societies lose their center, how individuals substitute form for essence, and how only the divine can re-establish what pride has undone. Today we step through the chapter not just as interpreters, but as participants, tracing a drama that is cosmic and local, timeless and timely, piercing in its judgment and radiant in its hope. Verse 1. The word that Isaiah the son of Amoz saw upon Judah and Jerusalem. This verse inaugurates everything with a paradox. The word is seen. That's the hallmark of prophetic cognition, truth, that is not merely received but beheld. Isaiah's role isn't self-appointed, it's relational, as the son of Amoz, vocational, as a prophet, and contextual, sent specifically to Judah and Jerusalem. This triad affirms that divine revelation isn't formless. It is given to persons, through vocation and for specific covenantal communities. It's localized truth meant to realign a real people in a real place. Verse 2. It shall be in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be prepared in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. The grammatical future here, it implies that this condition is not yet realized. So, what is described as coming must currently be absent. The true spiritual center, Mount Zion, the Lord's house, is not presently exalted, meaning other mountains like false powers, ideologies, and nations occupy that height. Divine order has been inverted. People do flow upward, but not toward God. The negation reveals that the spiritual magnetism meant to orient humanity toward truth has been diverted, leading to a kind of diffusion of purpose and allegiance. Verse 3. And many people shall go and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Here we see spiritual return through three layers: invitation, instruction, and action. The movement upward is not coercive. It begins with a shared desire, come, continues through divine education, he will teach us, and culminates in embodied practice, we will walk. This is the triad of true discipleship, relationally initiated, theologically grounded, and ethically enacted. This path reverses the disorientation of verse 2 by establishing a center that both teaches and directs the people. Verse 4. And he shall judge among the nations, and rebuke many people. They shall break their swords also into mattocks, and their spears into scythes. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn to fight any more. Often misread as utopian, this verse implies conflict and fracture that must be forcefully undone. Judgment and rebuke signal a divine intervention to correct the failed discipleship of those who did not ascend to instruction. Tools of war must be broken, not laid down, suggesting they had been clung to. This triad names a world suffering from karmic disintegration, Systems of violence self-perpetuate until grace confronts them. Peace arises not from sentiment, but from judgment that disarms conflict at its root. Verse 5. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the law of the Lord. This verse recenters the reader. Having shown what goes wrong, Isaiah now calls the people of God back into the light. But this is not individual salvation, it is a collective realignment. The house of Jacob is summoned to walk, not to theorize, and to do so in the law, not their preferences. The triad is covenant identity. They are still the house of Jacob. Collective motion, come ye, let us walk, and a harmonized path in the law of the Lord. This reasserts the ethical and spiritual distinctiveness of a people rightly ordered under God. Verse 6. Surely thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of the east manners, and are sorcerers as the Philistines, and abound with strange children. This sharp turn really shows the failure that comes when covenant is abandoned. Rather than embodying a distinct worship, the people have diluted their identity by just absorbing alien forms. Full of the East manners and strange children point to a kind of hybridization of culture and religion, not so much integration as confusion. God hasn't forsaken them on a whim. They've deconstructed themselves through syncretism. The triad is reversed now. Identity is fragmented, worship is disordered, and the divine image in the people has become unrecognizable. Verse 7. Their land also was full of silver and gold, and there was none end of their treasures, and their land was full of horses, and their chariots were infinite. This verse presents a vision of immense abundance. It's not yet condemned, but described in a way that reveals the structural potential of a nation resourced for divine purpose. The silver and gold, you see, represent material blessing, the kind of wealth that sustains and stabilizes. The horses indicate the capacity for motion, both literal mobility and metaphorical agency, the ability to act. The chariots, described as infinite, take it further, suggesting the development of complex systems and organized force. Taken in an affirmative light, this is a people abundantly equipped, not for self-exaltation, but for the realization of a higher calling. The triad suggests that when resources, motion, and structure are rightly aligned, they create a field of spiritual capacity, latent potential just waiting to be oriented toward the divine. Verse 8. Their land was also full of idols. They worshipped the work of their own hands, which their own fingers have made. So, following the previous verse's portrayal of capacity, verse 8 shows what happens when that potential is misdirected. Instead of lifting their wealth and agency in service of divine order, the people turn their creativity inward, fashioning idols from their own labor. The very same hands that could build temples or serve the poor now craft objects of worship for themselves. This isn't just a mistake, but an inversion. The creative power meant to reflect God is now directed toward self-generated images. Rather than being stewards of divine abundance, they become trapped in the worship of form, mistaking appearance for essence. The triad of idolatry, inversion, and misdirected worship reveals how abundance, when it's left unmoored from purpose, collapses into spiritual confusion and self-exaltation. Verse 9. And a man bowed himself, and a man humbled himself, therefore spare them not. This verse really confronts the ambiguity of religious posture. Outwardly, the people appear humble. They bow, they lower themselves. But Isaiah, he sees through it. This is not humility before God, but submission to their own creations, their idols. It's a false piety, a performance of reverence that honestly just masks a deeper rebellion. The prophet's discernment cuts through the gesture, naming it for what it actually is. True humility submits to truth. False humility bows to delusion. Because the act is a lie, judgment must follow, therefore spare them not. This isn't cruelty, but divine justice operating in the light of spiritual clarity. When truth is willfully inverted, mercy becomes complicity. The triad here really names the prophetic task, to see through appearances, to name reality, and to align with the justice that flows from God, not from spectacle. Verse 10. Enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust from before the fear of the Lord, and from the glory of his majesty. The false humility described in the prior verse now leads to retreat. Confronted with the actual presence of the holy, the people do not rejoice or repent. They flee. They hide in rocks and dust, not as an act of awe, but in terror and shame. The Lord's majesty is not oppressive, but to those clinging to inversion, it appears unbearable. This triad names a negated state, withdrawal from truth, isolation from the source of life, and fear not born of reverence but of self-condemnation. Where spiritual clarity should lead to transformation, it instead exposes a people unable to face what they have denied. The divine presence has not changed, they have, and so they bury themselves rather than be seen. Verse 11. The high look of man shall be humbled, and the loftiness of men shall be abased, and the Lord only shall be exalted in that day. This verse recenters the vision. God's sovereignty reasserts itself. Human pride, in all its forms, intellectual, cultural, material, is brought low. The language of the high look and loftiness is anthropological as well as spiritual. It refers not just to arrogance, but to a posture that denies dependency. In that day is not merely future tense. It is the moment of divine unveiling. The Lord is not made great by contrast, but revealed as the sole measure of greatness. In this triad we see divine sovereignty breaking through delusion, moral humbling enacted by reality itself, and the eschatological reversal wherein pride is exposed and truth enthroned. This is not destruction but right ordering. When the false scaffolding falls, the eternal structure stands clear. Verse 12. For the day of the Lord of hosts is upon all the proud and haughty, and upon all that is exalted, and it shall be made low. The final triad in this sequence, it really extends the logic of the last. What verse 11 stated as eventual, verse 12 universalizes. This day is not localized or partial, it is cosmic. Every false elevation is implicated. The proud, the haughty, the exalted, none are exempt. It shall be made low is not a threat, but an inevitability. The structures built on illusion cannot endure the weight of divine truth. This is the negated mirror of human sovereignty, the collapse of pretense, the fall of egoic systems, the undoing of all that attempted to rise without root. The triad names the storm of divine judgment, not arbitrary wrath, but the necessary unveiling of what cannot stand. Only what is true can endure the day of the Lord. Verse 13. Even upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and exalted, and upon all the oaks of Bashan. This verse invokes two of the most renowned symbols of natural strength and majesty in the ancient world, the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan. These trees represent the grandeur of creation, not merely physical height, but enduring stature, rootedness, and visible glory. The cedars and oaks can be read affirmatively as representations of human aspiration, rightly aligned with the created order. To grow tall in virtue, to become mighty in righteous influence, and to endure as living testimony to divine craftsmanship. Their exaltation is not condemned in itself. It is the noble potential of human flourishing within the ecosystem of God's world. Properly oriented, this natural grandeur, strength, and aspiration belong to the temple of the Lord. Verse 14. And upon all the high mountains and upon all the hills that are lifted up, while natural trees rise by organic growth, the mountains and hills here are lifted up artificially, signaling pride masked as elevation. The repetition of high signals, a piling on of pretension, the creation of symbolic hierarchies that attempt to displace or rival the true heights of God's authority. These are no longer natural aspirations, but systemic distortions, earthly projections of human sovereignty raised up as substitutes for divine truth. The triad in negation exposes how grandeur becomes grotesque when it forgets its source. False mountains that promise vision but deliver only confusion, structures that seem immovable but are built on pride rather than principle. These are the landscapes of idolatry disguised as achievement. Verse 15. and upon every high tower, and upon every strong wall. Now this verse shifts from the natural world to human architecture, bringing to mind two kinds of structures, towers and walls. Taken in a positive light, towers stand for elevated perception, watchfulness, vigilance, spiritual alertness. Walls, on the other hand, symbolize boundary and protection, the communal agreements that defend what is holy. So, in this way, the triad here describes a just civilization, one that protects its core values, keeps spiritual oversight, and really fortifies its culture with clarity. These forms aren't inherently wicked. They're the visible expressions of a society that's rightly ordered. When they're aligned with divine instruction, towers and walls aren't threats, but sanctuaries. They defend integrity without isolating and provide the necessary container for covenant life. Verse 16, and upon all the ships of Tarshish, and upon all pleasant pictures. Here Isaiah is exposing the cultural idolatries that often go unchallenged: economic power and aesthetic dominance. The ships of Tarshish, they represent mercantile wealth, global commerce, far-reaching influence. The pleasant pictures are visual culture, art and imagery used not to reveal truth, but to seduce, distract, and glorify self. This is really the Maya of modernity, form without essence, wealth without stewardship. The triad in the negative shows how beauty becomes a mask, and how commerce turns into a kind of religion. The ships, they don't carry the treasures of the temple anymore, but the desires of the ego. The pictures, they don't point to the divine, they reflect back only the hunger of the eye. The end result isn't a civilization of meaning, but one of curated illusions. Verse 17, and the haughtiness of men shall be brought low, and the loftiness of men shall be abased, and the Lord shall only be exalted in that day. This verse really restates, with a bit of force, the spiritual center of the chapter. The haughtiness and loftiness of man, they stand for not confidence but illusion, the belief that someone can construct a self apart from God. But in that day, which is a day of unveiling, not annihilation, only the Lord will stand. This triad affirms the purgation of the false self. It's not man's strength that's condemned, but his refusal to root that strength in the divine. As illusion collapses, the field clears for what's real to finally be seen. The Lord isn't exalted through destruction, but through revelation. When everything else falls away, his presence becomes undeniable. And this isn't humiliation, but transformation. The soul sees what it couldn't before, because now it's got nothing left to hide behind. Verse 18, and the idols will he utterly destroy. This final verse in the set declares a total unmasking. Idols, the material projections of false divinity, are not debated, negotiated, or critiqued. They are destroyed. The judgment is absolute because the illusion was absolute. There is no recovery of these objects. They are not purified, but eliminated. What we worship reveals what we are. In destroying the idols, God is not simply tearing down statues. He is dissolving the worldview that made them possible. This is iconoclasm, not as violence, but as mercy, the removal of all that separates humanity from the real. The triad in negation is complete, the end of illusion, the failure of false vision, the fall of gods made in man's image. The fire of truth consumes all that cannot endure it. Verse 19. Then shall they go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, from before the fear of the Lord, and from the glory of his majesty, when he shall arise to destroy the earth. This verse really portrays the moment when revelation breaks through illusion, and humanity experiences the full gravity of divine presence. The fear of the Lord here, it's not terror as we might think of it today, but the overwhelming awe that comes when truth confronts the false. To go into the rocks and caves is to attempt a return to elemental shelter, not to flee God in rebellion, but in stunned reverence. The rising of the Lord isn't just some arbitrary act of violence. It's the emergence of a truth so profound that all artificial constructs just collapse. This is the triad of awakening: fear as recognition, retreat as the first movement of humility, and confrontation as the precondition of transformation. Verse 20. At that day shall man cast away his silver idols and his golden idols, which they had made themselves to worship them, to the moles and to the backs. Here the idols, symbols of projected divinity, egoic identity, and misplaced trust, are literally thrown into the earth. Silver and gold, once venerated, are now discarded as burdens. The imagery of casting them to the moles and bats is especially telling. These are creatures of darkness, of blindness, and inversion. What was once worshipped is now revealed as beneath even the lowest creatures of the earth. The triad in negation here exposes the end of delusion. The idol is dispossessed, the worshipper disinherited of their fantasy, and false power laid down not in heroism, but shame. This is the collapse of ego, when the soul finally admits what it has loved was never alive. Verse 21. To go into the holes of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks from before the fear of the Lord, and from the glory of his majesty, when he shall rise to destroy the earth. Repeating and amplifying verse 19, this verse adds a new layer of paradox. Flight is both downward into holes and upward into heights. This is the double movement of repentance, burrowing into humility and reaching up in hope. The ragged rocks are not polished altars. They are the unmade places, natural and untouched by human pride. The soul retreats from its false world into what is solid, sharp, and real. The fear of the Lord again serves not to annihilate, but to realign. This triad signals restoration, the return to reality, the correction of spiritual vision, and the humbling that precedes clarity. Verse 22. Cease you from the man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be esteemed? The chapter ends with a sobering negation of human self-worship. The man whose breath is in his nostrils is a being utterly contingent, dependent on each inhalation, dust with animation, really. Yet this same being has claimed divinity, made idols, built towers, waged wars. The imperative cease is a final call to stop idolizing the human as ultimate. The triad here negates the delusion of immortality, dismantles every structure of ephemeral authority, and exposes the impotence of self-deification. It doesn't deny human value, but it ends the fantasy that man, unaided, is worthy of worship. This final negation completes the circuit, collapsing the last illusion so that true reverence might begin.